Why do we do science? Why do we spend countless hours measuring solutions, extracting samples, trying to know even more than what we know? Some would argue that the never-ending pursuit of knowledge through meticulous investigative science is as fundamental a human behavior as sleeping and breathing. Here, in the Department of Biological Sciences at Florida International University, we place special emphasis on exposing our majors to science as it is practiced in many different forms. We bring you a series of interviews of scientists from around the country that seek to answer the question, when and where did you feel it was most important to answer the kinds of questions you are asking in science? Before there were discoveries, publications, labs, there were ideas. And before there were ideas, there were students who had as curious a spirit as that which we train our students to have. And in between this all, there is life. Welcome to the first edition of our discussion of this life, his life, her life. Welcome to Confluence, where life and science meet.
So we're here today with Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who is a professor in the Integrative Biology Department at the University of California Berkeley. So welcome, Dr. Hayes.
Good to be here.
So what I want to do today is I want to talk about your life and your career and how you sort of approach the whole thing. And I thought it would be good to just start at the beginning, the best place to start. And you can tell us about where you grew up and what your childhood was like.
So I was born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina. I was the son of Romeo Hayes was my father, Susie Hayes, my mother. I was born in 1967 and have always had a passion for wildlife and nature and animals, in particular a passion for amphibians, but other things as well. Fascinated by snakes. You know, I kept a bird count, and beetles were a fascination for a while, dragonflies. Always general in nature, but amphibians always had a special place in my interest. And even as a child, really interested in science. Didn't exactly know what it was I would become or what I would do as a profession, but was always my passion.
And so at college, you really started to pick it up. Did you always want to, did you ever think that you would only work in academia? Did you ever think about, I don't know, like, nature photography or anything other than studying them, in a specific scientific way?
No, I think once I realized, because I did on my own. And with my teachers, I always did the biologies, the science fair, science project things. And by on my own, I meant they weren't required in my classes, but every year I tried to do something with, usually that involved environmental influences on development or behavior, and usually involved reptiles and amphibians. So I think in 8th grade, I did a big project where I looked at the anolis lizards that change color. And just having them as pets, I noticed that when they went to sleep at night, they didn't match their background. So normally if they were on a green background, they turned green. If they were on a brown background, they turned brown. But at night, they always turned brown. And so I became interested in why can't they match when they're sleeping? Do they have to see their background? Is it because the light's not there? Is it because the temperature goes down? And so I literally did these projects on my front porch. I had this big dog house. The kids would ride by and make fun of me. Where I would put the dog house over the lizard's cage during the daytime to see if it went dark, were they able to match color? Or at nighttime, I would heat them up with a blow dryer. And it turns out they have to be awake and see what color they're on in order to change it. So I won a prize for that in South Carolina. So I knew, it was a little bit simple, but that was the kind of stuff that I liked to do. And then when I got into college, I had to work. I had scholarships and grants and loans and stuff, but I had to work. And in particular, my freshman year, I took a second job working in a lab because I wanted to go, I call it a scam, but there was something called the Elephant Research Project, and I'd always wanted to go to Africa. And the deal for this project was there was a graduate student, and you paid tuition because he taught a summer course in Kenya, and so you paid him $2,000, and then you paid your flight to get over to Kenya, and then you tracked elephants. So basically, he'd take 6 undergraduates who were paying a couple $1,000s that funded his work, his project. So I didn't have that kind of money, so I took this second job. And it turns out I didn't raise enough money for the tuition or the ticket. But the lab that I was working in studied frogs, and Bruce Waldman, the professor, said, why don't you stay here this summer? And it was then that I saw, okay, this is what I want to do. He studied behavioral ecology in toads. Because, otherwise you just see professors teach. You don't really see what they're doing, what we're really paid to do.
Right.
And that's when I saw, okay, yeah, this is that thing that I want to do.
So it's almost by chance. I mean, it wasn't even something that you had, that you didn't know you wanted to be in that lab. You wanted to do something else, and then this just was an opportunity that arose. Yeah,
there were a number of job opportunities, like dorm crew and working in the dining hall. And, you could just, and my first lab job, though, was actually for somebody who's very famous now, but was just, washing glassware, and the students who could volunteer were doing the research, and I had a paid sort of work study position. So even there, I didn't really see the science and what was going on. And then this other project that I ended up in the summer from what's called an NSF REU program. Mm-hmm. So I ended up working there in the summer and actually really a part of the science. And it was field work and it was lab work combined, and that was the kind of thing that I wanted to do.
Now, you've also spent most of your career obviously studying frogs and toads and amphibians, but specifically you've been studying a chemical called atrazine. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could tell us about what atrazine is and why you're specifically interested in it.
So atrazine is technically an S-chloryltriazine. So it's a particular type of herbicide or weed killer. And I was introduced to atrazine by the manufacturer. So I was hired as a consultant to examine whether or not atrazine would act as a so-called endocrine disruptor, as a compound that would interfere with hormones and development in amphibians. And I was asked to do that because I was interested in my work. I have been since, dating all the way back to high school, interested in sex differentiation. So how do you determine I'm going to be a male, I'm going to be a female, and what are the developmental processes that get you there? So I was studying the role of steroid hormones in amphibians, again, dating all the way back to high school, really. And so I had some good models for how to look at how things might interfere with the natural processes of determining whether or not an animal becomes a male or becomes a female.
And so you had been working on that for a long time, and then this opportunity came up. And did you have any reservations about it, or was it sort of, this is just another project for me to work on? I mean, since it wasn't an academic research. It was academic research, but it was coming sort of top down from a large corporation.
Well, I think at the time this would have started in 1996 or 7 when I first started consulting for them. And at the time, I was a young faculty member, didn't have tenure yet. But it was very clear that the days when, for example, the National Science Foundation funded a career, that you got your first grant and they funded you until you were retired, were gone. And so we had been encouraged, and it was very clear that you needed to diversify where your funds were coming from. So the possibility of having private funding with more directed research, they wanted to know a specific thing, on some level was just part of what we had to do. Not just NSF, you have to figure out how to apply to NIH for what you want to do. You have to figure out how to get gifts and private funds, et cetera. It was just really part of, and there was this whole excitement because it came at a time when I was patenting some of my, basically using my science to patent practical models that people would want to pay for. Mm-hmm. So that was very exciting at the time as well. And my concerns were, I remember I sat down with my laboratory, and my concerns really were, at the time, because I knew nothing about atrazine, my concerns were this company knows that they're asking me to do something that's going to show nothing. And my concerns were I'd be looked at as a scientist who was being paid to do work that wouldn't show anything because that was to the benefit of the manufacturer.
So you knew going in that they wanted you to find a specific thing, a specific outcome to your research.
Well, I could probably be sued if I said that. But you have to imagine that if the largest chemical company in the world is asking you to test their #1 product, they're not hoping that you find something.
They don't want you to take it off the market, or encourage them to take it off the market.
Yeah. So I mean, they have a vested interest in a particular kind of result. Let's
Right.
put it that way.
And what was that moment like? Because, I mean, you discovered that atrazine was this actually, contrary to what the company was paying you for, or at least what they wanted,
Yeah.
they possibly wanted you to find out, was that it was a dangerous toxin to amphibians, at least, and possibly other
Yeah.
life forms. What was that moment like? Was it like a eureka moment, or was it like a, oh my God, what have I stumbled into kind of moment?
No, it wasn't either at first, because at first I was very naive, and I thought, oh, they'd want to know. I thought, if this compound has the potential. So what we found was, to back up a little bit, we found that if you give male frogs atrazine, that their testosterone levels were decreased, and their larynx or their voice box didn't grow, so they were sort of demasculinized. And ultimately we discovered that they were subsequently feminized as well. So males would grow eggs in their testes or grow ovaries. And my first impression was, great, they're going to be glad that I found this, because they wouldn't want this to keep distributing this chemical if it has this
Right.
potential. So really I thought, now that we have the hard data, that we'll work together to do further studies and keep going and further understand the problem. But it was a complete shock to me that we found something, because I never expected that we'd find anything.
And what was their initial response to it, as opposed to what you thought their response was going to be?
Well, their initial response was, quite frankly, to just slow down. You're moving too fast. Just slow down. That as long as you have one sample left, the project isn't finalized and we don't have to report it yet. Just slow it down. I mean, it was really sort of and that's not my style.
Right.
So they sort of distributed the funding, because I had 3 full-time technicians working on this, and so they distributed the funding slowly. And the way we work is, I just said, finish it, guys, and we just completed it. And I said, okay, we're done. Now we need to do the repeat experiment. And they just kind of, well, slow down. We got to,
Right.
As I said, their first strategy was to try to just make things go slow. So, you could pay the same amount, just don't work so fast,
Right.
kind of thing. And then in November, I forget the date now, but November of probably 2000, I guess, I resigned. And then after I resigned, I said, oh, by the way, I've repeated the experiment, we're about to publish it. Because we had been working the whole time in the background. And they said, well, you can't, it's our data. I said, no, you never signed the contract, you never paid me for it, it's mine. So the guy who was in charge of, so he had a firm working for them called EcoRisk, was kind of their front people. And he said, well, we're going to go to Novartis right now, or Syngenta right now, and they'll retroactively pay for the data and everything will be fine. And I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. I said, but you can come here if you want and see my data. But it's exactly that, my data. So they had a panel, and they came to Berkeley, and their strategy was then to suggest that there were errors in the data in the way that we collected it, and that it wasn't analyzed properly statistically. They claim that because I have undergraduates working, you can't be sure of the kind of the data that were collected. And in the end, that was moot, because I just said, it doesn't matter, it's my data.
Right.
And it's going out for peer review.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what you think of it. And then they supposedly generated data themselves that didn't match what I found. And some of that was published, but they were talking about it long before it was published.
Right.
So, and then later, those sort of personal attacks and those things came along as well. For example, on any level, said that anybody works for me, even if I'm paying the bills, that we work together to get
Right.
something done. And they couldn't understand that. Especially these people in corporate, they couldn't understand. What do you mean that your undergrad voted no, that you can't turn over all the, you can't turn over the project? I said, well, it's their data. They produced it. And we were able to raise funds, both private funds, National Science Foundation paid for some of it, to keep things going and to continue the work. And National Geographic paid for some of the work that we did. And the first paper got a lot of press, and I think now a dozen documentaries later, or something like that. It's been a productive line of research.
But you never had any, or maybe you did, if you ever had any personal doubts about, should I be continuing with this? What's the impact of this going to be on my career, or my family, or my stress levels, or anything like that?
Well, I've never been one to back down from a challenge.
It's a good thing.
And I think, yes, I think it would have been easier. Certainly for National Science Foundation, if we had gone on to do the track that we were headed down before, because they don't pay for anything practical.
Right.
They don't pay for anything useful. So their view now is that I do applied work, and so I've been until recently cut off from NSF funding.
And to students and people who are going to view this video, who might want to do something about this, do you have any advice for how people can get involved with these, with these causes or affect a change themselves like you have?
There are a number of organizations like EJAM, Environmental Justice Advocates of Minnesota, but there are a number of other organizations. Just last night I was at the Center for Environmental Health. They've been doing a lot. There's Natural Resources Defense Council, Pesticide Action Network. There are a number of different breast cancer organizations around. I've worked with a group called Black Women for Wellness down in Southern California. There's groups. Teresa Hines Carey has a women's health conference that I've spoken at a couple. In fact, I may have been the only male speaker both times. I think she pays completely for 1,000 women to come out on the East Coast. One was in Pittsburgh and one was in Boston. So there are a number of different organizations where people can turn, both local and sort of broader national organizations that are concerned about these issues.
So why do you think that this issue isn't more sort of publicly known, because I had never heard of atrazine, I'd never heard of environmental justice or environmental racism until I saw you speak, until I talked to you and, you told me about it. So, but it seems like it's a really, pervasive issue in our society. So why isn't this more of a talked about subject?
Well, I think part of the issue is you know what you know. I'd never heard of environmental justice either. And if you are fortunate enough that you're in a college environment and you've sort of moved away, then you're unaware of, because it's not directly impacting you. It's the same reason that I think people don't know as much about the disparities in cancer outcomes, for example, in minorities. If you're not African American or Mexican American and haven't witnessed somebody who's more likely to die, if that's not a part of your life, you may very well not be aware of it. And if you look at the numbers of African Americans and Hispanic Americans, for example, that are in science and that are teaching, you're not being taught it. Because it hasn't been a part of it's not, we do the things that affect us. I bet if every one of us trace back, why am I interested in this thing? There's something that happened in your childhood that made you go, oh, I want to do this thing. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of us.
Yeah.
And so if there are very few minorities in science, then that means there are very few people who've been faced with these, that maybe you wouldn't call environmental justice. I would argue, for example, that if you're in one of those situations, you don't know that there's anything wrong.
Right. And lastly, so outside of science, you also have a lot of different interests, like hip-hop music, spoken word poetry. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about why you think those things are important. Like, why is it important to have interests and activities and hobbies outside of science? I mean, do they ground you outside of science, or do they help inform your science in other ways?
I'm one of those people who I don't separate things. And
it's all interconnected.
And it's all interconnected. And I think to go just to start with on the professional level, you'll learn, if you haven't already, as an academic, that there's this conflict between teaching and research. If you're not teaching and doing, no. If you can't teach people about your research, then your research has very little meaning. At the same time, I would argue that to be a good teacher, you have to be involved in research so you know what's happening, what's new. I tell my students, if you have a teacher that's teaching out of the textbook, then you're learning history, not biology. Right? So you really sort of have to do both. And then at the same time, I don't believe that you can separate, you hear this, don't bring the office home. And in part, this is what happened with me in Syngenta. How can I do something for them? Slow my work down, not work hard, be dishonest, and then teach my kids that these are the qualities that you need to have. If I'm not doing the same thing at work. So I have to bring my home life, my personal life, to work. At the same time, I bring work home. I want my kids to know what I do. And I approach many of the things I do at home the same way I do them. I love to garden. It's one big experiment to me. I want to know what soil type will produce this type of corn, and where do I put this here, and how do I put it's the same thing that we're doing. The ultimate example of how these things synergize, I think, and then I'll get to the hip-hop stuff. The ultimate way that I think these things synergize is the following. You do a lot of field work, and when my kids were little, I always took them. And I remember my daughter hates these stories, but I used to take my daughter.
Well, it's going to be on the internet, so.
And we go out to the desert to collect turtles or frogs, whatever we're doing, and I take my 2-year-old. She was in diapers at the time, and she was about 2. And you can stay there for 3 days. You take a 2-year-old to the desert, they don't pee. You don't have to change your diaper. Because, the high surface area to volume, they sweat a lot, so they get dehydrated. And then you have the arginine vasopressin hormone, an antidiuretic hormone that limits the amount of water that's filtered through the kidney.
Are you like carrying her on your back or something?
Yeah, I had a little backpack. My daughter could run 2 miles when she was 4 years old. All right, so here's what I mean by not separating the things. I had great family time with my daughter, daddy-daughter time. She and I out in the desert collecting toads. That's personal. But I'm collecting toads for my research, so I'm getting my research done. And now when I teach my class on osmoregulation, my students all know it as the why my daughter doesn't pee in the desert lecture. So I start with my daughter and I tell all the things that are going on with her physically, all the places she loses water, all the hormones that are changing, and why you don't have many dirty diapers when you're in the desert. So it enhances my home and family life, my teaching, and my research. There's no conflict.
And it enhances your ability to embarrass your daughter, which is always a good
important
thing.
when she turns 50.
It is, that's very important.
So I don't think it's unique to Berkeley. I think that most universities, most organizations, even though they might talk about it, don't really want diversity. Diversity's work. I think what most people want is people who look different and maybe come from different places, but they act and perform and interact in ways that you're accustomed to.
Right.
And I think that's where the whole thing comes with the spoken word and what's professional and what's not. And my point was, by definition, what I've done is professional. You've accepted me as a professional. So what I'm doing might be different, but by definition is a professional. And I think, that's not just a spoken word, that's also what the name is all about.
Right.
Tyrone. My name is Tyrone. Nobody call professor, doctor if you want, but Tyrone is my name. And it's important for people to know that, where I came from. Otherwise, what's the point of recruiting people from different places and talking about diversity if you really just want them to get there and behave and act and fit in, if you will?
If they all have the same views about whatever the topic is, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. No, precisely.
Well, this has been a very enlightening conversation. I want to thank you for coming here today and spending your time with us. And I believe now we have some questions from the audience.
Hi, thanks for being here today despite your personal conflicts. We're really glad to have you. And I have two questions. The first is, you're really well known for bringing your science to the people and explaining the implications of your work. And I think with the work that you do especially, it's really, really important. But I also think it's important for other scientists to do the same. And how can we do that? In your opinion, what are some of the best ways that we can explain what we do to the public without having PBS documentaries and things like that knocking at our door?
I think the first step is, you've already said it, and that is you have to care. I think in some cases academia is a culture where we don't, and not in general, but certainly I think that's the case sometimes, where we expect that people have to come, quote, to our level to understand what we're doing. Because it does take an effort, and some of that effort is even something as simple as learning when to use and when not to use what I call doctor words, for example. And you have to make an effort to think about how you're doing that. And the perfect example I think of that is when my wife was pregnant. I remember we were at the doctor. She was pregnant with my son. And, my wife educated. She's educated in biology and all this kind of stuff. But, the doctor says to her, well, we're concerned you're experiencing preeclampsia. Which sounds like some venereal disease or something, right? My wife's looking at me like, did you give me preeclampsia? And all it is high blood pressure during pregnancy. And so I'm like, to the doctor, why would you say something like that to a pregnant woman? Why can't you just say, you're having high blood pressure and we're concerned about it? Why do you have to use what I call doctor words? So I think a large part of it is, and I don't know if you've noticed in my lecture, I'll often say the larynx or voice box. So I think sometimes you have to let people know that you know the fancy words, but you don't necessarily have to use them to get your point across. It can backfire, though, in a sense. I remember once I gave a talk, and I had a woman come up to me after, and she said, well, I understood what you're talking about, so how important can you be? And I understand that on a level. I love to cook. I cook. I go to a restaurant, and I can taste and figure out what it is, and I feel like that. I feel like, well, gee, I could have made that. I can make that. Why did I just pay for it? And I think that's what she was expressing to me. So you have to sort of find that balance between, the things that I'm doing, I'm especially trained to do the kinds of things that I do, but that doesn't mean that I can't explain it to you. And that's why I like that quote from Einstein so much, that you don't really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother.
So I'm sort of interested in your early life, particularly your jump from Columbia, South Carolina to Harvard. I'm wondering how a young black man from South Carolina ended up there and what you found in yourself that gave you the confidence to do that, and if you had any words for anybody who's either a racial minority or disabled or even poor that would encourage them if they are to make that leap, what can you say to them?
Okay, I'll tell you a story first. 100% true story. My mom hates it. 100% true. The first time I ever heard that I remember hearing of Harvard was on a show, Green Acres. It was a sitcom about a Harvard-educated lawyer who bought a farm and moved somewhere in upstate New York. And there was an episode where he's talking to another farmer, Mr. Ziffel, and he was a bad farmer. Nothing ever grew on his property. And Mr. Ziffel was asking him, well, where'd you get your degree anyway? You know, because he was such a bad farmer. And he said, Harvard. And Mr. Ziffel says, one of them new schools, huh? And I had no idea why that was funny. But after I took my SATs and all this stuff, I got letters from Harvard, and my first thought was, this is the school that Oliver Wendell Douglas went to from Green Acres. So that was my first time. And I always tell people I ended up at Harvard because I didn't get in anywhere else. And it's because I didn't apply anywhere else. So my mom had gone to some college, but didn't finish. My father wasn't able to finish high school. And I applied to Harvard, and I had gone to school out of my neighborhood. I'd gone to middle school and high school through these sort of honors academic placement tracking programs. And so when I got the letter from Harvard saying, congratulations on your SAT or PSAT or whatever it was and your academic performance, I thought, I'll go there. I never applied anywhere else. And it wasn't arrogance, it was ignorance. It never occurred to me that I might not get in. I just thought, they wrote to me, so they obviously want me to come. And then I distinctly remember must have been December, so I applied early, that everybody else was still applying to colleges in my class. And I thought, well, I'm done. Aren't you guys done? And they said, you only applied to one school? There was like this, you only applied to Harvard? And I kind of panicked. And then I got home that day and I got the phone call and the letter that I had been accepted early. So I never applied anywhere else. So I was very ignorant in my choice. And as I usually tell people, it was the worst 4 years of my life. But if I could do it all over again, I'd do exactly the same thing. There was the difficulty of coming from a public school in South Carolina and being in a private school where some huge, I'm not going to use a number, but after that story he told today, some huge number of kids had gone to private schools and prep schools and been prepared for Harvard. I wasn't. It was difficulty in being black and being in a place that, when I was there anyway, it was 16% minority. That included Asians. And I say that because, California is more than 50% at UC Berkeley, but it was 16% minority. And it was difficulty in the other black people, the other African Americans that I met there, were also from pretty well-off families and had done well and gone to prep school. And that was actually probably one of the biggest difficulties for me, was like, wow, even among the other black men that I know, they've had these, their life has been so different from mine. They were going to Bermuda for spring break and all these kinds of things. But, I met a professor who really took a big interest in me, and I met my wife there. And actually, as I say, if it wasn't for my wife, and she wasn't my wife then, but this woman that I met, and my professor, I never would have finished.
If you weren't doing anything related to science, if you weren't allowed to do it, what would you be doing with your life right now?
I don't think there is such a thing. I mean, I think the way that I garden, I guess you could say that's my hobby. It's really the same kind of approach that I take to science, and even the way that I cook, I think. I mean, I guess if I had like a fantasy job, I'd have like a little farm and a little restaurant where, one of these places where once a week, a group of people would get to come by and I'd cook up a big meal. But it wouldn't be a regular restaurant. It'd be a fairly high-end, fairly, organic, local kind of, because I love to cook. But again, it really is, I get the same kind of feeling with cooking and figuring out what ingredients and how much of this and that kind of, that I do when I'm doing the science. So I really don't see it as a separate thing from the rest of what goes on in my life at all. So it's kind of hard to imagine.
You do have a lot of students in your lab, undergraduates and special, and especially I think with undergraduates, they have a really heavy class load, and I'm assuming in Berkeley that's really the case. And experiments don't work, and things take a lot of time. How do you inspire them?
So I have a program that works very well. One, I almost never take the student who wants to do the senior project. I rarely take juniors. I get students as freshmen. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, and I've gotten this argument about how can you do this work with undergrads. And I would argue that my fourth-year undergraduate is better than anybody's first-year graduate student, because I've had them for 4 years, and they've been trained for 4 years. The other important reason for getting them as freshmen is by the time they're a junior, they're in this frat and this club and that. And not that classes aren't important, but that's what's taking up all their time. If you get them as a freshman and they have a desk in your lab, that's the thing that they commit to. By the time they're a senior, they're very serious. They've got 4 years into this. The other thing I found out, are there undergraduates in the audience? Okay. The other thing I found out is undergraduates love titles. So when they come in, it's a program. When they come in, their first semester is SOS, Semester of Service. So they're primarily involved with the animal care, and they have to keep records. They learn how to take notes. They take all the safety classes. They have to come to lab meeting once a week. And it used to be that they got no credit the first semester, had to be volunteer. I now have an endowment that allows me to fund them in the first semester. Second semester, they become principal technician. So they still might be doing animal care, but you don't start doing any lab techniques until your second semester. And then they start learning usually histology first, hormone assays, but it's a graduating program. Then in the third semester, they become study director. That means that even if I already have the project in mind, they have to write it up, they have to write up the hypothesis, and then they're in charge, because we do these large projects, they're in charge of managing the new SOS. And the culture it creates is you want to be as reliable and responsible as an SOS as you want somebody to be for you 2 semesters down the road. Because otherwise the project falls apart. If you don't have reliable people coming in doing, so they realize from the beginning the level of support and responsibility they have to have. Then after that, and a study director, they're in charge of teaching techniques to the student behind them. So they simultaneously, what we were talking about before, they simultaneously have this teacher-student role. Then some of the students go on to become project manager. So for example, if I have multiple species or multiple projects that are addressing the same questions but in different populations, I have one person that organizes all of the study directors involved in that, and that does all the managing and all the scheduling and things like that. And by the time they get to their senior year, and they're getting course credit, and by that time they're doing their senior thesis and things, and they're there year-round. There's somebody in my lab 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. As my undergraduate professor used to say, Santa Claus don't feed the tadpoles on Christmas. Somebody's there every single day of the week. And so it's a real, it's a real culture of, and sometimes I can tell you, sometimes these project managers, they lay down rules. I'm like, you can't tell people that. Like, you can't go home any weekend for the first semester. Like, you can't, they have, and I have had times where it became almost hazing, where I'm like, no, you can't, you can't require that people do these kinds of things. But oftentimes they have much stricter rules about, scheduling and timing and stuff like that than I would ever think of imposing on them. So it's a real call, and it really is a place that's run where we're all counting on each other to get something done. And of course, what you have to do is I have to say, well, yeah, I've had a black woman go to Harvard, I've had a black woman go to Yale, I've had a black woman at the University of Chicago, I've had a Mexican-American guy who's gone to Georgetown. But to me, those people who've gone off and done all those things, yeah, one, I wouldn't take credit for what they've done, right? But at the same time, I think I gave something to help them get there. But at the same time, those are people who, if it wasn't my lab, they would have found somewhere else, some way else. The students I think are really important are, I have a few students who've really had a tough time. And they're not ready now for graduate school or medical school. Some of them are still in my lab now. And those are the students that I know if they hadn't found that space, they might not have finished. Because that was me. So they're not all, those ones that I just talked about. But the ones I think that are most important are those students who aren't quite making it yet. So anyway, thanks, sorry.